By the time he was just 18 years old, he had already been kicked out of high school twice. Then he moved to Boston to become a professional boxer, only to get driven out of the city by the mob. But now Dana White is the CEO of the fastest growing sport in the world, just a few years after being told he only had a decade left to live. So how did he get here? And what was Dana's biggest secret to turning a fringe sport that was banned in 36 states into a $12 billion business? Because there was a specific strategy he used to do something that everyone thought was impossible, and he did it twice. Well, we're about to find out, because this is the story of the improbable rise of Dana White, president and CEO of the UFC. Dana White was born in Manchester, Connecticut on July 28, 1969. His mom, June White, was just 19 years old when she had Dana, and by 26, she was raising Dana and his younger sister Kelly as a single mother. Dana's dad, who himself was just 21 years old when he was born, was an alcoholic who left his family when Dana was 7, leaving June to raise the kids alone with help from their grandmother. The White family moved around in the 70s as June looked for work as a nurse. They eventually settled on Las Vegas, where nurses were getting paid well, and at the age of 9, Dana and his family moved to Sin City. Here he attended the Catholic high school Bishop Gorman, where he developed a rebellious reputation while also planting the seeds that would shape his life forever. Now, it was no secret that Dana White hated school. In fact, he even got kicked out of Bishop Gorman twice. The second time was because every morning on his way to the bathroom during his junior year, he would kick the door of the same nun's classroom shut. He said he did this as a way to help out his friends in that class because the noise would startle the nun so much that she would spend the rest of the period ranting and raving instead of teaching. And for weeks, Dana would do the same thing every morning. But then one day his shoe flew off as he went to kick the door, and instead of staying behind to retrieve it and risk getting caught, he just ran off. However, the nun found the shoe and later saw Dana walking the hallway without one, and as a result, he got kicked out of Bishop Gorman for good. But his mom still wanted him to finish high school, so she sent him back to the East Coast to live with his grandparents and finish his senior year in Levant, Maine. It was here at Herman High School where he graduated in 1987, but it's also where he picked up his new favorite hobby, fighting. See, after Dana graduated high school, he moved to the south side of Boston and started training at the gym of a local boxing and street fighting legend, Peter Welch. It was here that Dana fell in love with combat sports, specifically boxing, and he was willing to do anything to get involved in the sport. Dana started working for Welch for free, first as a trainer and then eventually as a cornerman, referee, and manager. Dana even had aspirations of his own to become a professional boxer. That was until he saw a punch-drunk fighter in Welch's gym and quickly decided against it. Now, while Dana was working for free at the gym, he considered going to college. In fact, he enrolled at 2 different schools, first UMass Boston and then Quincy College, a community college just south of Boston, but at both schools he dropped out in the first semester. This left him working a number of odd jobs, including laying asphalt, bouncing at an Irish bar, and even working as a bellhop at the Boston Harbor Hotel. But then one day at 19 years old, Dana had a revelation.
I was literally standing in the lobby one day and I'm like, what the hell am I doing here? What am I doing here? This isn't me. This isn't what I want. And I walked out the front door and one of my good friends, he's still one of my good friends today, who was the doorman, says, what are you doing? I said, I'm quitting. And he's like, what? What are you gonna do? I said, I wanna be in the fight business. He said, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard in my life.
But Dana figured he had to give it a try. Besides, he hated every job he ever had anyways, so why not at least fail trying to do something he actually liked? So for the next few years, Dana would ride his mountain bike around the city, attempting to work his way up in the fight business. This eventually led him to teaching boxing exercise classes at Welch's gym, which was his first taste of making money by doing the thing he loved. But that success wouldn't last long. See, in the early 90s, South Boston wasn't a great part of town. In fact, at 21, Dana had been beaten up within an inch of his life outside of a bar by a group of guys. But that wasn't even the worst of what he had to deal with, because one day while teaching a boxing exercise class, 2 men came into the gym and asked to speak with Dana. Confused, he agreed, which is when one of the men identified himself as Kevin Weeks and told Dana he owed them $2,500. Dana was dumbfounded. He had never seen these men in his life, and it was only later on that he realized who they really were. See, Kevin Weeks was the right-hand man of the infamous mobster Whitey Bulger. And after a few months of ignoring Weeks' request, Dana got a call to his apartment from Weeks, who told him he had one day left to pay the $2,500. or else. But Dana didn't want to find out what he meant by that. So he hung up the phone and immediately called Delta to book a one-way flight to Las Vegas. He left everything in Boston, determined to start fresh in Sin City. However, luckily for Dana, he wasn't returning to Vegas completely empty-handed. Dana was able to parlay his experience working at Paul Welsh's gym in Boston into a job at a boxing gym in Vegas. But he struggled for direction in the industry. He was still picking up odd jobs to make ends meet, one of which included living with Mark Wahlberg for 3 months to train him to play Vinnie Curto in a movie that never ended up being made. And he wasn't fully satisfied running boxing exercise classes for businessmen and housewives either. That was until 1998. See, around then, Dana was invited to a wedding of a longtime friend, and it was here that he ran into an old classmate of his from Bishop Gorman named Lorenzo Fertitta. Lorenzo and Dana had been friendly in high school, but they hadn't seen each other in 10 years, and were currently living drastically different lives. Dana was struggling to make it in the world of boxing, meanwhile Lorenzo and his older brother Frank had just inherited their father's booming casino business. But despite their differences, Lorenzo and Dana shared a mutual love for jiu-jitsu, and decided to start training together under the guidance of John Lewis. See, John was training clients on the side as he was fighting in this new mixed martial arts league called the Ultimate Fighting Championship. And during their training, John would introduce Dana to other MMA fighters like Tito Ortiz and Chuck Liddell. And given his background managing boxers in Boston, Ortiz and Liddell eventually asked him to manage them too. But this was back in the early days of the UFC, when fighters were making as little as $2,000 per fight with an additional $2,000 bonus if they won. And if we assume Dana was taking the standard 20% cut, that means he was likely only earning a few $100s per fight. However, as we'll come to find out, it wasn't the money that drove him. Instead, Dana found himself drawn to the chaotic spectacle of MMA and the UFC. But there was a whole other side of the business that Dana wasn't yet aware of. See, while he was still working as a manager, Dana got drawn into a contract dispute when one of his fighters wasn't paid. Now, in the early days of the UFC, fighters had virtually no power, a way of doing business that Dana would soon come to appreciate, but at the time, it meant that he didn't have a lot of leverage when it came to negotiations. So he looked for a different angle to get his client paid, and what he found proved to be much more damning. You see, in the early 2000s, the UFC was struggling for identity, acceptance, and mainstream appeal. Senator John McCain had even called it human cockfighting and sent letters to all 50 governors advising them to ban the sport of MMA, and many did. By 2000, 36 states had banned MMA fights, and McCain had even warned cable companies against airing UFC's events, even on pay-per-view. The fact of the matter was the UFC was a sinking ship. So when Dana called to ask why his client hadn't been paid, the UFC's owner, Bob Meyrowitz, finally snapped.
And he says, you know what? There is no more fucking money. I don't even know if I have enough money to put on the next event.
After hanging up, Dana immediately called Lorenzo and told him he should consider buying it. And a few months later, the deal was done. Meyrowitz's asking price was $2 million, which as Dana describes only got them 10 to 12 fighter contracts, an old wooden octagon, and the 3 letters UFC. Everything else had been sold for parts in an attempt to keep the company afloat. Meyrowitz had even sold off UFC.com to a company called User Friendly Computers to delay bankruptcy. But in January 2001, under a new parent company called Zuffa, the Fertitta brothers bought the UFC for $2 million, naming Dana White as their president in their first official move. Now, the purchase of this failing niche combat sports league barely made headlines at the time, but Dana felt like he had just bought himself a golden ticket.
We had a vision for this thing. We were big fight fans, and we believed that if this was done the right way, this could be the biggest sport in the world.
But how are they going to do that when they had some of the most powerful people in the country saying what they were doing was not a sport, but rather barbaric? Well, to Dana, the answer was simple. They had to lean into regulation. This not only meant introducing judges, time limits, rounds, weight classes, and a 10-point must scoring system, all of which happened before Dana and the Fertitta brothers took over, but adopting this standard set of rules, now called the Unified Rules of Mixed Martial Arts, across the country. And as states began approving them, even past critics of the sport, including John McCain, started to change their tune around the UFC. But even these new rules weren't enough to save the company. Because after 2 years of owning the UFC, the Fertittas had already spent over $40 million of their own money and had nothing to show for it. In fact, Dana recalls one phone call where the company almost died for good. saying, "Lorenzo called me one day and said, I can't keep doing this, burning all this cash. I need you to get out there and find out what you could sell this thing for." After some digging, Dana realized they would probably only get about $6 to $7 million, which he relayed to Lorenzo, who told Dana he'd sleep on it. Dana recalls feeling horrible, saying, "The first thing you think is, I just blew $40 million of my friend's money. You put all this time and energy into it, and it just doesn't work." Then he called me back the next day and said, "Fuck it, let's keep going." This resulted in the Fertittas pumping another $10 million into the business as one final Hail Mary. And their saving grace came in the form of a Trojan horse that almost no one could have seen coming. Now, in 2004, the main problem with the UFC wasn't that it wasn't entertaining. In fact, Dana recalls people being captivated whenever they came to a fight. The problem for most people was that the spectacle of it all was just too much. It was called too intense, too gruesome, too difficult to understand, or some combination of any other number of reasons. But the bottom line was that people didn't want to watch it, and more importantly, networks were too scared to put the fights on TV. That's when Dana and the Fertitta brothers came up with a genius plan to save their investment with a reality TV show. The Ultimate Fighter would feature professional MMA fighters living together in Las Vegas and follow them as they trained and competed against one another in a bracket-style format for a contract with the UFC. It was genius because it solved every problem the UFC had at the time. First, it allowed the company to work with a network that may have otherwise turned them down because each episode was pre-recorded and therefore didn't carry much risk. Secondly, it presented MMA and the UFC in a familiar format, which helped new fans better understand the sport and get to know its athletes. However, even with all of this going for it, not a single network was willing to pay to air The Ultimate Fighter. So Dana had to cut a deal with Spike TV that let them air it for free. A deal that would prove to return far more than the $10 million invested in the show. In just its first season, the finale showdown between Forrest Griffin and Stefan Bonner drew millions of viewers. In fact, the fight was so good that it was eventually inducted into the UFC Hall of Fame, but its real legacy is helping push the sport into the mainstream. Dana recalls how special that first finale felt in the moment, saying, "As soon as that fight was over, that was when I knew that we had made it. I didn't give a shit about if Spike re-signed us or not. I knew we had a winner." And they did. The show has gone on to have 28 seasons and is widely credited with saving the UFC. And with millions of new people now interested in MMA, they wanted more. But before Dana White could give it to them, he had to settle a personal score. See, in 2011, Dana's mom June released a book called Dana White, King of MMA, an unauthorized biography. And she didn't hold back. Not only claiming that Dana had turned his back on his family and friends since his success with the UFC, but she also criticized his marriage and business practices, among other things. Apparently, the last straw for June before writing this book came as Dana's grandmother was dying in 2010.
So she was sick and dying, and he hadn't spoke to her in 2 years. And he called her up and told her, "Graham, I'm going to send my plane to get you. I'm going to bring you back to Vegas to live with us. You're going to have the best medical care money can buy." And then she never heard from him again.
June claims Dana never even came to her funeral, even though she had helped raise him. But that's not all she said.
He's not a good person. He seems to have lost his character somewhere along the way. It's terrible the way he speaks of women and treats women. I do believe Dana's used steroids. His marriage is a joke. Everyone knows that he puts Tiger Woods to shame. The ring card girls sleep with him. He slept with his sister-in-law in my house, which made me absolutely furious. His wife they're constantly fighting. The honeymoon, she gave him the worst black eye I've ever seen. He nearly lost his eye. I do believe they have a monopoly. I don't know how anyone could think they don't.
Now, in a recent interview, Dana actually opened up about his relationship with his parents, saying that they had both died in 2023 and that he had put his relationship with both of them behind him. He also indicated that he never made up with his mother before her passing, not even attending her funeral. But regardless of what his biggest critics have said about him, from his mother to the media, none of it knocked the UFC off its tracks. By 2015, the company was grossing $600 million, and the following July, it was sold to a group of investors for over $4 billion, a 200,000% increase from the original $2 million purchase price just 15 years ago. For his work, Dana cashed in on the 9% of the business he owned, a stake that was now worth over $360 million. He was also given a new stake in the acquired business, as well as the option to stay on as president. However, many thought he wouldn't take it, since he now had more money than he could ever know what to do with. But for Dana, growing the UFC wasn't ever about the money.
If money was the big motivation for me, I probably would have retired in 2016. But no, it's not. Taking the sport to the level that we're taking it to, there's still a lot of work to do here at the UFC to get to where I envision this being from day one. And when you do what you love to do, I like breaking records. That's what I like to do. I like doing things that people say can't be done. And when you do those things, money is just what happens.
However, something much more important than the UFC would soon take hold of his life. Something that Dana had been pushing off for years. In 2022, Dana White had enough of the horrible shape he was in.
My legs were so fucked up that I couldn't put my socks on in the morning. I couldn't bend over to put my socks on because my legs were so screwed up. My sleep apnea was so bad that I rarely ever got any sleep. And I would wake up in the middle of the night and throw up almost every night.
Oh my God.
So I was throwing up so much that I was losing my voice. So I could barely even talk, and I wasn't sleeping. I was borderline diabetic.
All of this culminated when he visited a human biologist and self-proclaimed mortality expert Gary Brecka, who, among other things, claims that he's able to tell clients when they'll pass away to the month.
So I went down there, they did my blood work, and I'm dying to know when I'm gonna die. So he calls me up and he says, "We got your blood work back." I'm like, "All right, give it to me. What, tell me when." He says, "I'm gonna fly out there on Wednesday." I'm like, "Fuck." So by the time I was done talking to him, I was blown away. And then he said, "So do you want to know, how many years you have left?" And I'm like, "Yeah." He gave me 10.4 years.
And Dana bought in, spending 10 weeks with Brecka and losing over 40 pounds. Dana says he feels like he's 35 years old again, which has helped him bring the UFC to a whole nother level. And while MMA isn't quite the largest sport in the world yet, it certainly far exceeded what anyone thought it could be. Today, the UFC is worth $12 billion, and Dana still isn't slowing down. In fact, he's doubling down on combat sports with the start of Power Slap, which he says is now worth over $450 million and on the same trajectory as the UFC. Dana says he's using the same playbook to grow the slap fighting league into the next billion-dollar business by leaning into regulation and leading with content once again. He's also the co-owner of Thrill One Sports and Entertainment, which was valued at $300 million in 2022 and owned sports like Nitro Cross, Nitro Circus, and Street League Skateboarding. But at the end of the day, to Dana, none of this comes down to the money. Instead, he feeds off of doing the types of things people think are impossible, and sticking with them even when they seem destined for failure. Because that's what he's done at every stage of his life. And for better or for worse, that's what he plans to do until the final bell. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, I think you'll like my free newsletter that drops every Friday. It's called Bottom of the Ninth, and it's a 5-minute read that gives you the top 3 stories in sports and business from the week. Make sure to watch another one of my videos and subscribe so I keep showing up in your home and subscription feed, and I'll see you guys in the next video.